Thanks to all of you for coming out on this beautiful spring May 1st day to be indoors talking about a book on rethinking religion and world affairs. We're delighted that you would join us. This really is meant to be a relatively informal conversation about religion and world affairs to mark the launch of this book, Rethinking Religion and World Affairs, which I've edited along with my friends and colleagues Monica Toft and Alfred Stepan. And the purpose of this conversation is really to address two questions. First, what progress have we made in rethinking religion and world affairs? And then second, what further progress do we need to make in rethinking religion and world affairs? With respect to the first question, what progress has been made, we do think that a lot of progress has been made over the last 15, 20, 10 years. You can choose your marker in thinking in more sophisticated ways about religion and world affairs. When I was a graduate student 20 years ago, there was absolutely no way, if one were a political scientist, to do systematic work and study on religion and international affairs. I remember sitting down with a professor of mine who said, well, you know, I've started to think a little more about religion and world affairs. I was having lunch with him, and he said, you know, I'm actually working on an article now on culture, civilization, and religion, which will be coming out in Foreign Affairs in a few months. And this was Samuel Huntington, who was actually, at that moment, drafting and redrafting the Clash of Civilizations article. Clash of Civilizations, ? Was the article. But up until that article, which famously broke open a global conversation about religion and world affairs, there was not a lot of systematic study of the role of religion in world affairs. And it's very gratifying to think back over the last 20 years since that lunch I had with my professor in 1992, and here we are today in 2012. It's very gratifying to see that many, many scholars now in international relations, in political economy, in international security, in the study of development, now understand that religion is something they can no longer ignore, that religion is important. And so the purpose of our discussion is to try to track the progress that we've made, to try to look and reflect back on the further thinking and rethinking that we've done that this book that we're launching today marks. And if you'll forgive me for a moment, I want to boast a bit about the book. This is what the event is about. I can boast about the book because, in a way, the relationship between editors and edited volumes is a lot like the relationship between parents and children. We all realize, if we're parents, that we can take very little credit for how our children actually turn out. And I, as an editor, realize I can take very little credit for how this book has turned out. It's turned out far, far better, totally out of proportion, certainly to my own contribution. The book includes 18 chapters covering a vast range of issues in religion and world affairs, religion and development, religion and gender, religion and American foreign policy, religion and secularism, religion and democratization, religion and interreligious dialogue, a wide range of issues. And these 18 essays are written in a way that is designed not for academic specialists, people who speak the language of political science or sociology, but designed for people who simply want to understand the role of religion in world affairs and think about it perhaps with respect to their profession, whether it's public policy or whether it's journalism or whether it's development. So the book is designed for a wide audience. We worked very hard to make sure that it would be accessible. There are 18 relatively short essays on a wide range of topics. And I'll just say one other thing about the book, that is that it remains extraordinarily relevant for a vast range of key issues that we're facing today in world affairs. Just consider for a moment 4 major issues that, as it were, are pulled from the headlines that this book has something to say about. First, we've all been hearing about the role of social media in the Arab Spring, how the internet and social networking contributed to the revolutions that we've seen over the last 12 months or longer in North Africa and the Middle East. This book actually has a chapter about the role of the internet and social media in Muslim-majority countries, written before the Arab Spring revolutions, anticipating much of the important developments that occurred. The article is by Muzad Baroujerdi and Nicole Allam. Consider another issue pulled from the headlines. What will be the future of democracy in Egypt and Tunisia? What will a democracy look like after the Arab Spring, as constitutions are being written in Egypt and Tunisia? Several chapters in this book deal directly with the issue of Islam and democracy, explore different models of relating religion and state in a way that's compatible with democracy. The discussion of these issues by Jose Casanova, my Berkley Center colleague, one of the major contributors to the volume, discusses this issue and argues that secularism is not a precondition of democracy, that it's possible to have a full-fledged democracy that is not secular. Alfred Stepan, my co-editor, has a chapter in this volume on the twin tolerations, which directly contributes to thinking about the relationship between religion and state in the context of democratization. Elizabeth Hurd, her article touches on this. Thomas Farr, with whom I have the privilege of being leader of the Religious Freedom Project here at the Berkley Center. Thomas Farr is the director of the Religious Freedom Project, also has a chapter in this volume on the relevance of religious freedom as an important issue for the advance of American interests and also for the development of democracy in countries like Egypt and Tunisia. Finally, consider another recent issue. I don't know how many people saw the Kony 2012 video, which had a huge influence and following on YouTube and Facebook and elsewhere. Kony 2012 highlighted, of course, the terrible violence perpetrated by a extreme religious sect, the Lord's Army, Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. And it also, the video highlighted the need for post-conflict reconstruction in many countries in Africa that have been hit by terrible violence and conflict. Well, as it happens, several of the chapters in our volume address these issues. Monica Toft, my co-editor, has an extremely insightful chapter based on long years of study of religion and civil wars, of how religion contributes to civil wars, how religion has a distinctive role in helping, in some cases, to make violent conflicts more intractable and more violent. But we also have chapters that show the other side of religion's contribution. We have a chapter by Dan Philpott, which shows the role that religion can play in building peace and reconciliation after countries have been torn by violence and conflict. I could go on about the chapters. As I say, there are 18 of them. The director of the Berkley Center, whom you just heard from, Tom Banchoff, has a fascinating article about interreligious dialogue in the aftermath of the controversy about the Pope's remarks at Regensburg some years ago. Diane Winston has an article about the role of the media in covering and also contributing to the so-called Saffron Revolution in Burma. We have a wide range of chapters on many topics. So buy the book, read the book, teach the book, and spread the word. So enough boasting about the book. I want now to begin a conversation with my colleagues from the volume about the two questions I mentioned earlier. One, what progress have we made in rethinking religion and world affairs? And it's important to ask about this because there was a time, as I alluded to not that long ago, 20 years ago, say, when it was hardly acceptable at all in academia, in policy circles, even to consider that religion might be an important issue to explore. Because of the hold of secularization theory and because of other factors, religion was considered a not acceptable topic to discuss. Then I think we had a kind of second wave of rethinking that thesis, which I alluded to when I mentioned Samuel Huntington, who contributed to the idea that actually maybe religion is something we should think about. But in this second wave of thinking, religion was almost universally assumed to be something dangerous, something threatening. It was often considered under the rubric of fundamentalism or extremism. So that, I think, was a kind of second wave of Rethinking Religion and World Affairs, which dominated Western discourse through the 1990s and in some ways intensified after September 11th. Now I think we're in a third wave of thinking about religion and world affairs, where there's increasing recognition religion is complex. It's not just bivalent, it's multivalent. It is powerful in its own right. It isn't merely a reaction against other forces. And in a way, the book, Rethinking Religion and World Affairs, is meant to document how this third wave of thinking about religion and world affairs is making progress in a number of aspects of religion and world affairs. But in a way, we hope that our thinking will be surpassed by a fourth wave of even more sophisticated thinking and rethinking about these issues. Our thinking and rethinking about these issues is not complete. There are many, many aspects of these issues that have only just begun to be explored. And in a way, that's the primary purpose of our discussion today, is to push even further the boundaries of what need to be discussed and to ask what further research needs to be done, what further reconceptualization needs to be done in order to make further progress on religion and world affairs. So without further ado, in framing the discussion that way, I'd like to turn to my distinguished colleagues, and first to my co-editors, Monica Toft and Alfred Stepan. I'd like to ask Monica Toft to speak first. It's a special privilege to be able to introduce Monica, who's been a friend for many years. She's also my colleague in the Religious Freedom Project here at the Berkley Center, where she is part of our scholarly team in the Religious Freedom Project. She's also co-author with me of a book, God's Century. So I'd like to ask Monica to speak first. Monica, you'll have a full bio in front of you in the sheets that you would have from the back. So I won't read her full bio, but she's author of numerous books. One being the Geography of Ethnic Violence with Princeton University Press, isn't that right, Monica? A number of other books since then. She's currently Associate Professor of Public Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government and Director of the Initiative on Religion and International Affairs at Harvard University. And it's a great pleasure to have you, Monica.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks to the Berkley Center for hosting this launch. And also I want to mention that not only did the Luce Foundation provide funding, but also the Social Science Research Council, which Al actually is still on the board for the initiative looking at religion and sort of the disciplines in social science. And it's been an incredibly important initiative because what it's done is brought together scholars, some of whom hadn't studied religion directly, but now many people are taking much more seriously and problematizing and bringing them together in regular fora, providing opportunities for them to talk with one another, funding, of course, and then for the publication of these kinds of volumes. So I'd like to also thank the SSRC for this opportunity. So Tim asked us to talk about where were we, where are we now, and sort of where do we go from here. And he sort of presaged my remarks. It makes sense that we're co-authors because we think alike. But I'm going to just share a story with you. When I started, teaching on this topic, and David Little and I were teaching a class together with Brian Hare, who's Professor Hare, but he's also Father Hare. And I had a student, this is at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, so these are not people who are dullards in any sense, but it was shocking how ignorant one of them in particular, but a number of my students were about religion. And one of my students one day came up to me after class and asked me why Professor Hare wears the same outfit every day. And I really was dumbstruck. And of course, as an instructor, a lot of it's acting, and you're supposed to not be. And I almost said, "You've got to be kidding me." But to me, it was sort of a grave illustration of the degree to which our students are ignorant, but also the fields in which we were trained. The faculty were trained in their fields. When I'm trained as a political scientist in international relations, and religion just really was not part of the bailiwick. It was not part of the materials that I studied. But I was a student of ethnic conflict and ethnic violence. And so my trajectory and how I've come to religion and studied religion has sort of mapped onto scholarship. And I think the volume that we've produced is really sort of the cutting edge about how the field has evolved. And Tim talked about 3 waves. And indeed, the first wave, which is reflected in my research, is just looking at religion in very bare bones. What is religion? And we sort of had a, back of the envelope about there has to be a divine being, supernatural presence, text, and if you look at the first wave of scholarship that emerged in the late 1990s, but really sort of taking off after 2001 into about 2004, it was sort of, what is religion? And then how does religion play out? And Tim is absolutely right, and I'm sort of guilty of this. It was religion in relation to conflict and violence. We were all terribly concerned that there was something unique, something nasty about religion, and we looked at it sort of skeptically and nervously. But then after that, sort of trying to get a handle on this global resurgence, whether there was a global resurgence of religion and what does it look like, you started seeing more sophistication. And so the second wave has really been problematizing religion. What is it? And the field has gotten better, or research and scholarship has gotten better. There are exceptions to the rule. Sociologists of religion understood this. Jose Casanova, he understands the theological bases of motivation and why people act. But I have news for you, political scientists didn't, and they didn't care. But it was only with the second wave that people started saying that there's got to be something unique about religion that motivates people, this notion of sacrifice. And so the second wave was starting to problematize religion as a motivation in the political arena, sociologically, economically. You're now starting to have people, and research and scholarship is coming out. Scholarship takes a long time. Tom is in the policy arena, and policymakers like it immediately, but it's going to take time, I think, for us to be able to inform the policy arena even better. But economically, how does religious motivation, influence people's transactions with each other in the economic sphere? And that research is sort of evolving as well. And so where we were was really just sort of basic ignorance and trying to get a sense of whether and then how religion operates. And then the second phase, or the second wave, was really trying to understand in a more theological terms the motivation of individuals, how that translates into groups, where again I think our volume is a bit ahead, and maybe it was because, I don't know, our inclination, mine, Alan, Tim's, was interdisciplinary research and understanding that not one discipline has sort of a corner on the market, so to speak, on how religion operates in order for us to understand human relations and world affairs. And so what I would hope is, as we move forward, Tim mentioned some other arenas, of course, understanding policy, is that scholarship in the future really does become more interdisciplinary, where you have sociologists regularly talking with people coming out of religious studies programs and divinity schools, as well as political science. Tom had a nice turn of phrase earlier in a meeting talking about, changing the conversation to changing the game. I actually think we still are in the phase of changing the conversation. We're still trying to figure out what the conversation is and what it should be. And I think changing the game is actually where we're going to be maybe in the next 5 to 10 years. As scholarship like this volume that's coming out is read by policymakers. What's nice about the volume is that the essays are short. They're done by the best scholars in the field. And on top of that, there's resources in it. They don't have small words. They do have some ontology, I think, is used at least once in the volume. But it's also a resource. And so we really, and I have to credit Al with this. Gosh, he beat us over the head. Insisting, again, along the lines that we want to move scholarship forward and be more modern and hip, of having an internet resource database in that. And in the back of the book, we have a listing of what we consider as a group of scholars to be the top 25 websites that you can go to for data about what is happening in the religion around the world, be it media coverage, data about different forms of religion, and data about different groups or institutions of religion.
Also with our analysis.
And they're annotated. Yeah, they're annotated, and we actually...
They're all annotated with judgments.
Yeah, and then online, the Berkley Center here, we thank them, they're going to be housing permanently with hundreds of websites. And so...
It's a great thing.
Yeah, so from the perspectives, again, talking about where we need to go from here, the first is it's interdisciplinary. I mean, religion by its very nature as a topic of study, it has to be done that way. And then on top of that, sort of using multi-sources, both texts, we can talk about religious texts, but then also media, different kinds of media to get a handle on it. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Monica. Let me introduce Al Stefan. But before I introduce Al Stefan, I just want to emphasize that, I guess appropriately enough, this project is in a lot of ways very Trinitarian. You've got three editors, but it really is important to recognize the project is possible. It's possible only because of three institutions, particularly the Luce Foundation, which funded the project, joining with the Social Science Research Council, which convened us, and then I think also the Berkley Center, which in a lot of ways is trying to carry some of the work that we began in this volume forward. So I want to emphasize that, and thank you, Monica, for mentioning that. Alfred Stepan, if you don't know who he is, which would be surprising if you've done any reading in political science or international relations, Alfred Stepan has been a giant in the field of thinking comparatively about political development and democratization for a number of decades. He's done extremely important work on democratic consolidation, democratic transitions, many books. But in the last 15 years, he has become one of the most influential and important and creative scholars in religion and global politics. He is director of the Center for the Study of Democracy, Toleration, and Religion, and Wallace Sayre Professor of Government at Columbia University. As I mentioned, his current work focuses on religion and politics, and he is expanding his 2001 article, The World's Religious Systems and Democracy, Crafting the Twin Tolerations, which appears in the book, into the book we're launching today, into a monograph on the topic. I could go on, but it's been great to have you, Al. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank the Berkley Center for convening us. I think that's marvelous. And you heard that they're going to take over some of the key parts of continuing this project. And that's wonderful. So thank you, Tom, and thank Berkley Center. And Monica finished her remarks with, where do we go from here? Well, I can only speak for myself. I'm going to get in an airplane and travel. I can't believe it, but I have 2 years sabbatical, and well, 1 year paid sabbatical and 1 year I'll craft, but I think it'll happen. So basically I have 27 months. So what's a good thing for someone like me to do with 27 months? Well, actually I started, to some extent you go back to your roots. And I've always been, despite all these social science categories and chairholders and so on, I started my career as a special correspondent for The Economist. And I still think that is one of the ways I can start thinking about things. I just don't believe what I've written, more or less what other people write, unless I actually go there, talk to people, think about it, and normally go back a second, third, or fourth time. So in a month, I'm making my 4th visit to Tunisia in the last year. And that's crucial for how I try and think. And what I'm really going to do is, I said, I'm looking at every one of the world's major religions, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Orthodoxy, Judaism, from the viewpoint of, I consider all religions multivocal. By that I mean there are elements in them that create problems for toleration and create problems for democracy, in all of them. And it's a mistake if we don't realize that. And all of them, and I try and document this, have things that are usable for toleration and democracy. And then it's normally then a struggle in societies of which values they want to struggle for and privilege in their own place. So what I'll be doing, and there's some, when we think of the different religions, there are interesting problems that come up from this for each one of them. Buddhism, probably from the founder's viewpoint, the founder has written less that causes any problems from the viewpoint of toleration and democracy of Buddhism than any other one. However, there's not a country in the world that has a Theravada Buddhist majority, and there are 8 of them, that's a democracy. So that's a puzzle that I really have to think about. I'm beginning to get some edge on it, and it's not really the political theology of Buddhism, it's the lived history of Buddhists and their image of what they consider a good society. And I wrote a lot about Sri Lanka, and I've been to Thailand. I'll go back to both of them and think about this. But what I mean here is that to some extent, their image of a good society, it's not from the Buddha, but people who lived in Sri Lanka, was, and really this is before democracy and before colonialism. So that image is, it's, almost think of it as a big vase of us with water. We're all in this vase together. We're all Buddhist, and we have a king who helps us, and we help the king. Okay, it can be people who are outside the vase, but you don't think about it until the question of elections come up. If the question of elections come up, then you have to address the question, hey, we got 23% of the people in this country, Sri Lanka, that's a Buddhist country, that are Hindus, and they speak Tamil. And what's their place here? And partly because they took up education more rapidly than the Buddhists in the South, they were overrepresented from the Buddhist viewpoint in public sector jobs. So actually what happened was the Buddhists began thinking about themselves as a majority with a minority complex. And this really, there's something like this in Thailand too. So the question of Buddhist societies dealing with territorially based minorities that are majorities in some area, 22%, 23%, how do they become part of a community that's a democracy? You don't have to address that question before colonialism and before, because your community, you might have a funny shape, but these people are up in there in the Northwest, they're out of it. They're not part of it. Okay, I think every one of the religions that you look at can face something. Judaism, one of the problems there that people like Michael Walzer talks about, and he's writing a 3-volume history of Judaism with other people. He said Judaism, for understandable reasons, was never, since the fall of the temple, we've never ruled any state. So religions and states that develop theories of how you treat minorities are majorities ruling. But if you've never been a majority ruling, this is a weaker part of your political history and your philosophy. Not that it's against it, but you really have to work on it. And so Michael Walzer, terribly proud of being Jewish, really focus on this. One of the great political theorists, he thinks that's one of the major things he has to look at. And I will be involved with that project a bit there, and I'll go back and forth between Palestine and Israel. Every religion, something interesting comes up like this. And for Islam, I started with a pretty simple, dead simple observation. One, because, as I said, my career as a journalist, I travel all the time. I constantly get in airplanes. When people said that there are very few, that they have, many Americans, without quite thinking it through, have a syllogy in their head. Every part of the syllogy is wrong, but nonetheless, it's that no Arab countries, well, this is, all Arabs are Muslims, wrong. No Arab state is democratic. I think Tunisia will be. But for a time, sometime that was correct. Therefore, no Muslims are democratic. Well, this is absolute nonsense, but it just, but the Arabs are only 22% of the world's Muslim population. There are actually 400, I knew, because I'd been in Indonesia, I'd been in Sri Lanka, I know that at independence, the world's largest Muslim population in the world was in India, and they're part of the Indian democracy. So there are basically 400 million Muslims that live in democracy. But the question for me is not so much the outrageous things. I think the world needs to know, how did those countries that are Muslim majority actually become democracies and have a degree of toleration? And I'll include India in this. So I'm really, I've just helped edit a series of, we have a series that's come out of Columbia on Islam, toleration and democracy in Senegal, same title in Indonesia. That's another book, and we have another book on Turkey. There are different problems and so on, but I want to really figure out how it happens. Or I just wrote an article on Tunisia. I think that the civil society movements in opposition were immensely creative in Egypt and immensely creative in Tunisia. Some of the most creative I've seen. I put them right up there with the Brazilian and the Polish. They're immensely creative. But as a political scientist and someone thinking about democracy, we have to think of something we call political society. Political society is, what type of elections do you create? What type of constitution do you create? What are the political rights of all the citizens? It's a significantly different area than civil society. In this sense, I would say that Egypt has the worst political society of the 17 countries I've looked at in democratic transition. And Tunisia has actually one of the best. So that's a fascinating thing to study itself. And part of the mystery, I did not find this out in my first visit to Tunisia. I did not find out in my second visit to Tunisia. I did not find out in my third. But at the end of the third, I found out something that was amazingly similar to what I'd seen and understood in Chile. In Chile, the Christian Democrats hated the socialists, enough so that they helped bring in Pinochet, and the socialists hated the Christian Democrats because of that. But at a certain moment, they said, look, let's agree that both of us hate Pinochet more than we hate each other. Let's also agree that we made a lot of mistakes. And let's agree if we ever have a chance, we'll do it differently. By the way, this is the same discourse that Juan Linz and I have documented for Spain. Huge discourse. Basically, the Spanish transition was almost done while Franco was alive, because people had arrived at positions on this. Okay, in Tunisia, I was flabbergasted. Every year since 2003, 5 of the 6 parties that are the largest parties now in the Constituent Assembly met privately and discussed this question. The secularists said, we would like to make a democracy, but we can't trust you, Islamic group. And the Islamic group said, we would like to make a democracy, but you're never going to let us participate. And they talked about this. And they began working through the next 8 years, giving each other a series of relatively credible commitments and binding guarantees, almost all of which have been honored. And so one key thing in the twin tolerations is that religious people have to give sufficient autonomy, toleration, of democratic authorities that they say voters are sovereign. And that voters and citizens write laws. They have to accept that. If you say it's God-made law, then this is a violation of the twin tolerations. And on the other hand, secularists, and if you're a hard secularist, Ataturk secularist, Bourguiba secularist in Tunisia, what I call the iron triangle of hard secularism, 1905 secularism in France, that secularism almost doesn't give much space, sufficient space for religious individuals to speak in civil society, to act in political society. Now, they declare this illegal. Even to this day, the constitution in Turkey virtually declares it illegal for religious people to act publicly. Okay, so there was this debate, and the secularists got a lot of things out of the Islamists, and the Islamists got a lot of things out of the secularists, and so far everyone's honored this. But then they had to do, this is political society. They say, what sort of electoral system we have? And Ennahda, the Islamist party, said, let's go for PR, proportional representation, because they actually knew that if there was a simple majority election, they still, even though they've been exiled, almost all of them, and out of the country, they would win a simple British type of first-past-the-post plurality in 90% or more of all the areas. Then that would be perceived as Algeria, and people wouldn't participate in it. So actually, Ennahda said, let's go for PR. Because their guess was that they would get 35 to 40% of the vote. In PR, they'd get 35 to 40% of the seats. So they have 39% of the seats. Now, what's great about this, and Ennahda understood it, and everyone understood it, if you function as a parliamentary group, and that's what the Constituent Assembly is, you need 50.1% in the coalition. So it now only has 39%. They have to make up the ruling coalition with secular parties. And if they don't accept this, and they let their constituency that are not as socialized as the leaders demand things, the government will fall. And so these are serious political constraints that people will understand. Okay, I think every one of the religions I can do stuff like needs having some work done like this. So I'll write a short chapter on Senegal, a short chapter, long chapter on Indonesia. I'll write a very long chapter on India, etc. Thank you very much. That's what I'll do on my holiday.
Thank you very much. I want to introduce now my friend and colleague Thomas Farr, who'll be familiar to anyone who's been around the Berkley Center. Tom Farr is director of the Religious Freedom Project here at the Berkley Center and visiting associate professor of religion and international affairs at Georgetown's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Tom spent most of his career as an American diplomat, worked on a whole range of issues. Towards the end of his time as a Foreign Service officer, served as the very first director of the Office on International Religious Freedom. Since leaving government service, he has written widely about religious freedom. He has written, for example, an article on foreign affairs, diplomacy in an Age of Faith, published in 2008, written a book with Oxford University Press called World of Faith and Freedom, Why International Religious Liberty is Vital to American National Security, and has thought deeply about the importance of religious freedom for American national interests. It's great to have you speak, Tom, particularly after Al has spoken about the twin tolerations, so I look forward to hearing you, Tom.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Tim. I'm delighted to see some of my former colleagues in the audience today. Welcome to you all. As Tim has suggested, my contribution to the volume and my contribution today will be on the policy side rather than the scholarly side. And Tim has asked us to look at two questions. What progress has been made in rethinking religion and world affairs, in my case, in the policy world? And, you know, what is to be done? The second question, what further progress is needed and what might we do? It's a lot to cover in a few minutes, but let me give it a shot. I think that there's been some important progress made in the last decade on in the policy world, but that much remains to be done. Let me give you some examples of progress that has been made and then turn to why I see, as Monica put it, that we are hopefully beginning to change the conversation, but we haven't changed the game. I think there's a question as to whether we are in the game yet. But let's see. I think discussion on religion in U.S. foreign policy probably needs to begin at least with the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which, as many of you know, mandated that the State Department, that any administration advance U.S. Foreign policy goals include religious freedom. And so we've had, under 3 administrations, this policy developed. So we have a bit of a track record, and it has developed under 3 administrations, and it's taken some important steps forward under each. Today, we see the fruits of much of this. The Secretary of State, Secretary Hillary Clinton, has a working group on religion and U.S. foreign policy, including a subgroup on religious freedom and foreign policy, which I have the privilege of belonging to. The Foreign Service Institute, which is the training ground for American diplomats, has begun to institute regular courses on religion and U.S. foreign policy, 3-day courses. There is an interagency working group within the State Department. It includes the National Security Council, the Defense Department, and other parts of the United States government who talk about religion and U.S. foreign affairs. On the Hill, there is a bipartisan International Religious Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives. You will know from having paid attention to this President and Secretary of State that they've both given some interesting speeches, important speeches on religion and U.S. foreign policy. One thinks of President Obama's speech in Cairo in June of 2009, in which, you may recall, he laid out some 5 or 7 issues between the United States and the Muslim world, and one of those issues was democracy and another was religious freedom. So I consider this progress, having been around in the days when my first boss in the Office of Religious Freedom, Bob Seipel, loves to tell the story when he showed up in 1998. The only thing that was there for him was a desk and a vacuum cleaner. And he said the latter was more relevant than the former. So we've made, if you start with that base, we've certainly made quite a bit of progress, and I think Bob would agree with that. But there remain some problems, and I'll sort of round out my remarks by focusing a bit on those. I think the nub of it is that the progress that we're making still kind of remains on the margins. That the way that American foreign policy deals with religion, and especially in the way that it deals with religious freedom, which after all is a statutory mandate of American foreign policy, remains very much ad hoc. That is to say, it depends a lot on the people who happen to be doing one thing or another, who happens to be the ambassador, who happens to be involved in this or that other aspect of American foreign policy. If we're lucky enough to have someone interested in this issue, then that's quite good. If we don't, then that's the issue gets subordinated, and that's not a way to run a policy. That's what I mean by ad hoc. The FSI courses that I mentioned, which are very good, nevertheless are voluntary. So the vast majority of Foreign Service officers never go to these courses because they're too busy. So the way you fix that problem is you put them into the existing curriculum for Foreign Service officers when they come in, when they're going out to post, when they become ambassador, that sort of thing. So you make it mandatory. So it's an important step forward, but it needs a bit more in order to get where we need to go. The President's Cairo address in 2009, which I remember cheering from the sidelines when I read the address and heard of it, led, as many major presidential addresses do, to working groups, interagency working groups within the State Department, the National Security Council, and elsewhere. And there were working groups on all of these issues that I mentioned, but not one on religious freedom. When the ambassador at large for this administration finally took office, we were 2.5 years into the administration, well over half over. It tells you something about the prioritization that is given to the issue. So it is becoming far more important than it once was. There are many people who are paying attention to this, and I will say that we, in the question, or trying to address the question of what can we do about this. I was heartened in the earlier meeting that Monica referred to. We were talking about, and Al Stepan in particular was sort of going through a number of the, I believe the way you put it was power centers, Al, that are in academe that are beginning to focus on this and really devote some resources to the issue. Of course, the academy, translating the academy and scholarship into the policy world, as you can imagine, is a very difficult thing to do. But I think it is terribly important, because it's in the nature of our democracy, that we have this back and forth between the academic world and the policy world, between think tanks and policymakers, and that is as I think it should be. So we have, as Tim has mentioned, a program here at the Berkley Center called the Religious Freedom Project. And our goal is to try to stride, if you will, these two worlds and bring them together, the academic world and the good, wonderful work that's being done, including in the book that we're here to talk about today, on religion and international relations, to bring that to bear on the foreign policy of the United States. We are going to have, for example, in a couple of weeks, a session on Al's work in Tunisia, which he's just been mentioning to you, and gave you a little bit of a flavor for his application of his work on the twin tolerations, which has been out there for over a decade, and how he would apply it to Tunisia. We are gathering policymakers from the Hill, from the State Department, from the White House, from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I don't know if you knew about this, Al. I hope this doesn't scare you away. From the CIA.
Some Marines. That was in Marines.
Marines. Ex-Marines. There'll be at least one ex-Marine there. Policy policy people, people who have to carry out American foreign policy. So here you can see we're trying to make this connection for people. We don't want to use great big words, and Al is very good about, I won't say dumbing it down, but speaking clearly. Speaking clearly, you just heard him do it. And so we want to make this relevant to the world of policy. I will also tell you some other things that you might be interested in looking at. If you go to our website, the Religious Freedom Project website, which you can find on the Berkley Center website, we have a number of videos that we have lots of written products, but there's some videos that you might find interesting. A conversation, changing the conversation. For example, we had back in November a conversation between two of the great American thinkers on religious freedom, Michael McConnell, former federal judge at Stanford Law School, and Noah Feldman at Harvard Law School. And the subject was, what's so special about religious freedom? We asked them, you know, why do we have this? What does it mean? And there was a fundamental disagreement between them about, not about what it meant at the founding, but about what it means today in America and what it ought to mean in terms of the law. Fascinating. You can watch it on our website. We had a debate over the HHS mandate, which has raised the issue of religious freedom in domestic American politics. We went to Oxford a couple of weeks ago, and we had there a conference on the issue of emerging conflicts between religious freedom as traditionally understood and new rights claims made by homosexuals. The tension between these, we don't shy away from the difficult issues. And we had a fascinating series of debates, which you can see or will be able to see shortly on our website. A whole host. Oh, and I should also mention, finally, and then I'll stop. A debate, an hour-long, really a conversation between one of America's preeminent Catholic thinkers at Princeton University, Professor Robert George, and one of the outstanding American Muslim thinkers, a convert to Islam named Hamza Yusuf. And they talked, Hamza Yusuf has founded the only accredited Muslim American university at Zaytuna College. He's a fascinating man, and the two of them talked about religious freedom and a whole host of other issues. Please watch it, and you'll see the conversation that we're trying to engender, not only in the academic world, but to take it to the policy world as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks very much. Now it's a pleasure to welcome Michael Barnett for the first time to the Berkley Center, if I'm not mistaken, Michael. Wonderful to have you. Michael is professor at George Washington University at the Elliott School of International Affairs. He previously taught at the University of Minnesota and the University of Wisconsin, also Macalester College, Wellesley College, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was a visiting scholar at the New School for Social Research and the Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. He's written many books. Earlier in his career, he worked very much on Middle East politics and Arab political development. More recently, he's done outstanding, groundbreaking work on humanitarianism and international affairs. Has authored a book called The Empire of Humanity, which came out last year, isn't that right, Michael? And is about to come out in a couple of months with a new edited book called Sacred Aid with Janice Stein on religion and development and humanitarianism. Groundbreaking book, which I had the pleasure of reading recently. So please welcome Michael Barnett.
Thank you, Tim. I'm an outlier. I'm as an international relations theorist who probably could be the poster child for ignorance of religion and world affairs. I was somewhat surprised to be invited onto this project because as I told them at the very start, I really don't know anything about religion, but was happy to participate thinking that I might learn something. And I have to say I learned a lot. I learned a lot just listening to everybody here on the panel, but I also realized I know less and less about religion and world affairs. So I have to sort of introduce my conversation with that kind of caveat. I have to say also that it's been just such a privilege for me to be part of this group. As I said, I've learned so much, and it's, I think, evidence of their living their ethics of tolerance and inclusivity that they would actually allow someone like me to participate. again, taking Tim's question about has there been progress, I want to stand back and, without apologies, talk about it from the standpoint of international relations, and just suggest that, in fact, there's some good news to report, that things are better. As I mentioned, I didn't come to the subject of religion lightly. I did so with incredible trepidation, much like I think a lot of IR scholars who really would rather just stay as far away from religion as they possibly could. And it wasn't my previous work in the Middle East that dragged me into religion. It was actually the work I'd been doing on humanitarianism. I just found that I couldn't get away from it. And so since I couldn't run away, I might as well just try to figure out how it is I was going to think about this relationship between religion and humanitarianism. More on that in a second. But as I've worked through as they've sort of tutored me in the study of religion and worked my way through a lot of the literature, I became more deeply impressed. And in fact, after a while, I began to tire of the standard articles that would begin, there is no research on the study of religion in IR, and I just thought to myself, how many more of these can be written before we just simply have to retire that in favor of, we actually know a lot more today than we did 10 years ago, and this is actually good news. So I think that there actually is a growing body of work that actually stands on its own and is worth reflection in terms of this relationship between international relations and religion. Let me give a slightly different version of that progress by just simply marking 3 stages in some sense of the sociology of knowledge in terms of how we think about knowledge accumulation and whether in fact there is a growing body of work on religion and world affairs. That first stage is kind of what I would just simply call shock and awe, which was a matter of external events simply encroaching on our very secularized world of international relations theory. And it is a secularized world, and not by accident, actually by design. But we all know the events that began to happen. We obviously point to 2001, but also there were other events in the 1990s. There was the Iranian Revolution. And basically, there was a lot of things that were going on in the world that international relations scholars just could not run away from as much as they wanted to. It just seemed to be more and more important, and they actually found that religion was one of their gaping omitted variables, as they would talk about it. Religion's an omitted variable. And by talking about religion as an omitted variable, it meant that when they were looking at the big outcomes in world affairs, they began to wonder whether they need to take religion into account. Or can't we just simply explain all the big events, including 9/11, or including the fall of the Berlin Wall, through our standard categories like nationalism and other maybe economic-oriented or power-oriented theories. But in fact, what we found was that, in fact, religion seemed to be playing more and more of a role, and it was getting more and more intense in the ways that neo-secularization theories began to describe. And so the second stage really was, I think, more, I would say, empirically driven, which is show us that it matters. So this is more about international relations scholars standing aside and saying, okay, you've convinced us there's something going on that we should sort of stop and maybe assess, but now show us. So we're agnostic. Basically throw religion into the hopper and begin to show us the difference that religion makes. And there was, I think, an incredible amount of very good work that began to come as a consequence. I would just point to Monica's work in the issue of civil wars as a tremendous example. I think that, that's done an incredible amount of labor in terms of putting religion on the map for international relations scholars. And it sounds like we're, in fact, more resistant than policymakers are to the study of religion, if that's possible. But I think we're entering, in my narrative, a third phase that I think is actually quite interesting, which is IR theorists having to sort of wrestle more with what are fundamentally conceptual issues about what is religion. So in fact, I would reverse it a little bit in terms of your narrative, and I think actually, again, shameless book plug, but not my own, is God's Century, is I think actually very good at actually being conceptually precise and also trying to be empirically grounded and trying to think through these issues of does religion make a difference? And essentially, it's complicated. Let me just take a few minutes then and just sort of reflect then about how this has influenced my own work and my contribution to the volume. My work on humanitarianism actually sort of began as a puzzle, which is that when I looked at the history of humanitarianism and I looked at the origins, it was pretty easy for me to say no religion, no humanitarianism. It's hard for me to imagine that humanitarianism would exist today without religion, yet as I studied humanitarianism over the centuries, I found humanitarianism just simply disappearing into a wisp of the religious part, into a wisp of a secular sky. And I found that puzzling, and then I sort of played back the reel, and I found that, in fact, there seemed to be more religion that's present, but it seemed to be disappearing in the mist. And I couldn't quite figure out how to make sense of where to place religion in the question of humanitarianism. So I was fortunate just to thank a funder who's actually funded a lot of our work, the Luce Foundation, was able to win a grant with my friend Janice Stein and begin to ask, what difference does religion make? And the understanding here is that the humanitarian community operates with the distinction between religious and secular organizations. So for them, these are distinctions with a difference. And we were curious about, is there really a difference? Because when you build a latrine in a refugee camp, it doesn't seem to really matter. There are just technical requirements of how you space a latrine. It shouldn't really necessarily matter whether it's a faith-based or a not faith-based organization. And you can see this over and over again in a lot of technical areas. And so there were, I think, various reasons why we began with something of a disinclination to believe that religion makes a difference. We began to ask people in the sector, how does religion make a difference? How does it make a difference? And we began to find some interesting answers. Increasingly, though, what we found was that religion did important work for us, that there were some, I think, interesting differences between religious and faith-based organizations, which we actually talk about in this, here's my shameless book plug, Sacred Aid, that'll come out in a few months. But what was fascinating for us was the extent to which secular organizations spoke in kind of sacred terms. As they spoke of humanitarianism, they talked about it as an ideal, as a sense of moral progress, as the world of ethics, as opposed to the profane world of politics. And the extent to which also religious agencies seemed to be dealing with their own questions of secularization. As they got bigger and bigger and bigger and more technical, they seem to be actually losing their religion in various ways. And so we increasingly found that, in fact, these categories of religion and secular were in many ways constraining. That beginning with these categories couldn't really tell us at the end of the day what was going on in the world of humanitarianism. And what we found instead was having to sort of pull back a little bit, and this is our takeaway line, is find that rather than thinking about religion versus secular, we began to play around with the sanctification of the secular and the secularization of the sacred. The extent to which humanitarianism always had these kind of interesting elements of what may be thought of as the sacred, but also of the secular, and how it is that those boundaries are constantly negotiated, not simply abstractly, but as we see all the time by aid agencies in the field. And so for us, the takeaway line was that we actually don't have a very good idea about religion, and we also became a little bit worried that international relations scholars, when they begin to operate with this term of religion, may do so with a rigid term that in fact is completely inconsistent with the way students and scholars of religion think about religion. And so one of our worries was, one of our warning signs was, as IR scholars think about religion, let's think so in ways that borrow from, frankly, people like Jose Casanova, and think about these things in more sophisticated ways. So I think at the end of the day, and now I can stop because Katherine's here, I'm sort of, I don't want to say I'm hooked on religion, speaking as someone from outside, but the study of religion challenges how IR scholars should think about the world. I think it is one of those fundamental categories of existence and meaning that actually will make it difficult for international relations scholars, if they take it seriously, to in fact ignore it and to think about their own theories of international relations in the same way. I also just want to conclude by thanking the editors for inviting me on this journey, because I learned so much, and I think the volume is first rate, and I'm proud to have been included. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, I'm tempted now to invoke the language of religion and miracle because Katherine, just literally in the nick of time, has come from Boston, where she had to be, and she was kind enough to actually cut short her trip to Boston just so she could be here in time. And my goodness, you are in time to speak. So thank you so much, Katherine. That's really marvelous. So it's my pleasure to introduce Katherine Marshall, who again will not be a stranger to people who've been at the Berkley Center. Katherine has many claims to fame. She spent almost 4 decades at the World Bank, working mostly on issues in Africa. She's now a senior fellow here at the Berkley Center, where she leads the program, the work here on religion and global development. She moved to Georgetown in 2006. She also serves as a visiting associate professor in the School of Foreign Service. She helped to create a major initiative at the World Bank when James Wolfensohn was president, called the World Face Development Dialogue. She played a major role in creating that program, and she now serves as the executive director of the World Face Development Dialogue, and has 2, not just 1, but 2 chapters in the volume Rethinking Religion and World Affairs, so has a special claim to fame for that reason. Thank you, Katherine, for being with us.
So what's the topic?
You're to talk about how much progress have we made, Katherine, in thinking about religion and development. And since you've done well, and that as well, and since you've done all the work on religion and development, I hope there's been progress on religion and development. You can use a microphone.
Okay, it's actually rather difficult to come into this distinguished panel, shall we say, at this stage. And just to give you the background, I've come from quite an interesting conference in Boston of largely evangelical philanthropic groups, but also including people representing impact investment. And the theme was essentially gender and gender in the church. So I'm bubbling with ideas on that subject. But just in general, to give you a very quick version, some of you have heard this before. The president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn, met, I'm still not quite sure how, the Archbishop of Canterbury at a time when there were fierce riots going on and fierce protests about the World Bank, but also the development world, the development community much more broadly. It was a time of not far from Seattle, from Genoa. Whenever you wanted to have a meeting at the World Bank, you put up chain link fences, had riot police in Washington and in other places. And their basic sense was that it made absolutely no sense that these 2 worlds, which were the primary advocates for the poor, the primary groups that were most concerned about inequality, injustice at a social level in the world, meaning the development institutions, including the World Bank, and the religious worlds, because it was a very broadly defined set of religious worlds, would be at each other's throats. They should be trying to work together and at the minimum trying to speak to each other, which was something that was not happening. And so they launched this in 1998, well before any other part of the United Nations, which is a fascinating story. Before almost all the bilaterals, before companies started talking about this. It was really a very fortuitous, shall we say, event. And so they had several meetings of very senior religious leaders. The next chapter in the story is that there was really very broad agreement. And so they decided we need to have an organization and we need to work on this. And so they drafted me, among other things, but created the institution, started to recruit a head to the institution, got a managerial review by Bain and Company, etc. But the next chapter in the story was really a shock, which is that all hell broke loose. And what sounded like a very bland, almost innocuous, harmless initiative about dialogue. It was about dialogue. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. About dialogue. Generated fierce opposition from virtually every one of the 184 member countries of the World Bank. So we spent a great deal of time, and in fact, the initial part of our journey was an effort to try to understand why this was a subject that generated such fierce opposition. And in fact, I have one interesting parallel on the subject which relates to the two chapters. And I think I had the instinct or insight, whichever it is, before this plea came to me that we can't have this book without a gender chapter, which is the other part of the story. I was part of the early years of institutions really accepting that women might be part of the institution, that they might hold jobs other than secretarial jobs, that they, and that women were part of the development process. I'm old enough that I remember very well the letters from universities saying we don't accept girls, and every single step of the way was going up against ceilings, glass or otherwise. But one of the interesting questions, there were two interesting questions actually that came up. One was that in the early years when people started talking about the importance of gender in development, of thinking about what women did distinctively, listening to their voices, looking at the power relations. In those early years, first of all, you couldn't get any interest. The only people who showed up were the limited women. If there were any men who came, they would giggle, and they would really be quite skeptical that this was even in some way a plausible topic. But what I realized, and it's led me to another conclusion, is that gender issues are profoundly personal. That very few people are able to separate their views about the relationships between men and women from their personal experience. And that's why you had this level of emotion. It's also, to me, more challenging and more significant, a more significant revolution coming with modernization than any other transformation, because it affects every single person in their relationships from the time they wake up until the time they go to sleep. And so that is, I think, part of what has made it so difficult. But what was interesting to me was that religion has many of the same characteristics. That religion is something that people do not look at the same way as water supply. They don't look at it in the same way as agricultural practices. They don't look at it in the same way as power, or even ending war. It's something that, and it's frustrating because it means that very few people are able to separate their views about religion from their own beliefs. And it has made it exceptionally difficult to treat it as a professional topic that deserves to be analyzed and deserves to be presented as a subject for inquiry and active dialogue. And there's a whole story behind the objections that people raised, the questions that people have posed, the preconceptions they bring. But the progress that we have made, and that I think is reflected at least in part in this book, the book is, there's much that's happened since the book was actually put to bed, is that there is much more discussion about the role of religious institutions. And in that category, you might put Catholic Relief Services, Islamic Relief, Jewish World Services, World Vision, the monster of them all, but also hundreds of thousands of smaller institutions that have a sort of NGO or community organization characteristic. You have the enormous roles of the actual religious institutions themselves. You have the roles of religious leaders as influential people. Poll after poll suggests they have more trust than almost any other sector of the community systematically. I think no one beats them across the board, though they do in some places. And then, of course, the values and norms that are not unique to religion, but which are part of it. So, as I would say, if you're looking at any topic from AIDS to zebras, in other words, HIV/AIDS, if you're looking at malaria, if you're looking at tuberculosis, at maternal mortality, education issues, water supply, corruption, you name it, if you're missing this huge set of worlds and ideas, you're missing a major part of the story. Where we are now, we've done a fairly intensive mapping exercise, both by region of the world and by, not by any means all, but at least a representative sample of topics among those that I listed. And we are now at the stage, we think, where we have a reasonably good understanding of what the roles are, what the parameters, we call it the mapping, the sort of landscape. And we're now at the stage of asking ourselves constantly, and we have two questions that we ask all the time, and that people basically ask. You know, you'll go to someone and they'll say, well, you know, religion and development, very important. They say, that is really interesting. I hadn't really thought of that, is almost the standard answer. But then you can almost see the wheels going, and the question is, so what? In other words, why does it matter? In what way does it matter? And then there's the so what next question. In other words, what do you do with it? And just as an example, we've witnessed over the past really 6 years, the Gates Foundation, huge player, fascinated by the roles of religion in health, aware, I mean, dealing with these very fluid statistics that large portions, the estimates, just to give you an idea of what we don't know, go from 5 to 70% of health care in Africa being provided by religious institutions. 70, which is an indication both of definitions, of hybrid, of ignorance, of a fascinating story of how one number sort of generates another and then generates another, and so on. But the Gates Foundation was absolutely fascinated by this and did quite a lot of internal investigation, a lot of dialogue, some of it at Georgetown. But in some sense, I think they realized that it was so complicated that it was very difficult to deal with. In other words, there's not one sort of funnel that you can use. There's not one agent. There are thousands of agents, tens of thousands. And I think they're in a quandary right now as to how to deal with it, as are most of the other institutions. So in that sense, there's a period of enlightenment. There's a period of reaction. There's an awareness of the need for better knowledge and understanding. But there's quite a lot of unease about how to move, dealing with the complexities, which include the perception of conflict, the perception that religions are not evidence-based, concerns about proselytism and the social impact that has, questions about, and this comes, that will be my last comment, but one of the major issues that came up is many perceive religion as counter to development, opposing development, and therefore, and the most important issue there, the most important issues turn around gender. And the perception that religious institutions are against women's rights, are against equality for women, and stand against it, don't understand it. And every picture that you see of groups of men, male religious leaders, reinforces that image, as do many other public events.
Thank you very much, Katherine. Please join me in thanking our panel. Those were wide-ranging, fascinating, provocative reflections. I do now want to open the floor to those who want to ask a question or make a comment. We have another 30 minutes or so, so please do raise your hand. If you would identify yourself, let us know who you are, and make a comment or ask a question. I do want to say that the book you've heard so much about is actually on sale outside, right across the hall, at a reasonable discount, as I understand. So please pick up a copy if you're interested. Yes, go ahead. Oh, yes, sure, yes. Yeah.
I'm Nancy Hewitt, retired Foreign Affairs officer, and one of the first people that Tom Farr hired in the Office of International Religious Freedom. I just wondered if the book is available as an e-book.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I believe it is. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Tim seems to think it is,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is.
It should be.
Yeah, that's.
Okay.
Oh, that was an easy question.
But we didn't have a proper answer.
I'm pretty sure it is.
Mr. Chairman, two quick comments. Bob Riley, American Foreign Policy Council. One, I was a little startled at your remark that this relationship between religion and international relations didn't exist 30 years ago. As a member of the Reagan administration, I can tell you that it did, because of the very large role of President Reagan's informal alliance with John Paul II, Poland, Eastern Europe, etc., to say nothing of the misbegotten use of Islam in Afghanistan prior to and during that. And I just wanted, on Professor Stepan's remarks on Egypt and Tunisia, found very interesting and completely agree with what you said. I wondered if in your journeys you have looked yet at the contribution that the educational curriculum in those two countries have played, particularly in respect to that of Tunisia, which, in the estimation of many, was for many years the most enlightened educational system in terms of its content in precisely teaching tolerance.
First, in response to your being surprised, I was really only talking about the academic study of this issue, not about the real world. Yeah. There's a big difference.
It's an interesting question about Tunisia. If I were talking about Indonesia, I would say tolerance and deeply embedded in the educational system. Women have access to education. If you look at boys and girls between the ages of 11 to 15 in Indonesia, 97% of the boys are literate and 96% of the women. Then you get places where you get no entry, like Pakistan. The Secretary of Education for the Northwest Frontier Province says that no one from his office has ever entered into 80% of the madrasa schools. They're just outside of their reach. And I assure you, they enter into every single one in Indonesia. So they often craft something. I think the Tunisian case is, I'm not directly answering your question, because it was harder, because in fact there was almost no space. I have a slightly different take on it. Almost no space for religious education in Tunisia, and that is one of the major problems. For instance, it was such a hard secularist government. I mean, there are many things that were good about it. It has the most progressive women's rights legislation in the Arab world, and so on. This historically, but they simply didn't allow any education, any Islamic theological education, or any access to radios or the media. Well, people are interested, and in the modern world, everyone gets their information in Tunisia about Islam from the Gulf states, from Saudi Arabia. So this is just, they better in a big hurry start creating their own radio stations that talk about religion, and they ought to have a political theology that's related in some sense to Islam, but also to Tunisia. So the Indonesians are terribly good at that. They say, look, our religion is universal, but if we're talking about a political system, democracy is about the governance of a territory. This territory is Indonesia. And we better think about what's special about Indonesia and how we can rule this place democratically. There hasn't been that creation of an intellectual infrastructure within Islam in Tunisia yet. The people who made all these amazing pacts were people educated by and large outside. Ghanouchi spent 21 years in exile in England.
Tom?
I mentioned President Obama's June 2009 speech. So the bureaucracy can kill things. And presidents are very important in our system, but foreign policy often is run by that great aircraft carrier floating down the Potomac River called the State Department.
Yes, please, Simon.
Hi there, Evan Barry from American University. I wanted to ask a question that I've heard a number of people on the panel ask. Basically, what is religion? I come from the Department of Religious Studies. That's my academic background. And this is a point on which there are a lot of people in religious studies really excited to see political scientists and IR theorists talking about religion. And I wanted to couch this in the terms that Professor Barrett developed, which is that if religion is a variable, we sometimes see it conflated with other variables that are sort of the standard bearers in political science, national identity, ethnicity, race, etc. And I sort of hear this lasting connection between religion and those other terms throughout the speakers today. So I'd like to hear a little bit of the panel's thoughts about that set of connections and also about what the sort of state of relations between political science and religious studies as disciplinary cousins. Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you. Do you want to take this up?
Yeah, I can take it. So, you know, in my own work, I've sort of had to grapple with that. What is religion? And then how does religion relate as a variable within my own scholarship? And as, you know, volume editors of this book, actually, I think much of the first meeting when we all met together as a group of 20 people, we debated at length, I remember it was probably 4 hours, about whether we, as a set of scholars trying to get traction on this issue from across different disciplines, by the way, should come up with a definition of religion. And some people were absolutely against it, and others said, absolutely, we should. We have a responsibility and obligation to help guide the next, you know, volume that may come out. And in the end, what we decided, and which I think is, as one of the editors, I think we made the right decision, was it's up to the individual scholars to define what they believe religion should be, is, how it needs to be defined for whatever it is that they're analyzing, it being peace, conflict, democratization, I don't know, transnational networks, whatever it might be. Because different disciplines, different scholars, different sets of phenomena require different kinds of operational analyses. So we did grapple with it. I don't think our conversations made it into the final volume, but it's a great question, but I think it's basically one that's unanswerable, and it really falls onto the shoulders of the individual scholars about how they're going to use religion or define it, and whether it's the thing being explained or helping to explain some sort of process that you're interested in.
Just to say quickly that in response, it's, I think, very important that there be much more contact between political scientists and scholars of international relations, world affairs, and religious studies scholars. That, I think, is something that Michael touched on and others have touched on. There is not very much sophistication among political scientists in terms of thinking about what is religion, precisely these issues. You're too kind to say so, perhaps, but certainly there's just really the beginnings of grappling with this very important question. As you know, there is tremendous ferment in religious studies on this issue, a lot of recognition inspired by critical theory that religion has a very particular constructed history which has much to do with Western colonialism, and that's an extremely fruitful and important line of thinking that has to be taken seriously. In many respects, even the very concept of religion, as William Kavanaugh has written in a book called The Myth of Religious Violence, even that concept is bound up with a very particular historical construction that has to do with Western political projects, in part of privatizing religion. So we have to really be very critical in the way we think about religion. At the same time, I would resist the kind of critical postmodernist dissolution of the concept of religion. That, I think, is a danger of some of the trends in religious studies, where the concept is completely destroyed and is rendered impossible to use in any way. So I would want to fight for some notion that there is something substantive, something distinctive about religion. It's difficult to say exactly what that is. What is distinctive about it? What really does define it and separate it from other phenomena? I think there is a something there that is different and distinctive. We can get perhaps into that a little more if we want. But it seems to me trying to define religion in a purely functional way is a problem, because then anything can become religious. Anything can be invested with sacred significance. On the other hand, Michael Barnett in his work has shown it actually can be useful in understanding the history of humanitarianism to recognize that some secular activities have been invested with a sacred significance. So this is an excellent and yet very challenging set of issues that you've raised, and one, I think, clear area where we need to make much more progress on.
Yeah, just if I could just add, because I agree with you. I don't think there's much interaction between scholars of religion and political scientists. I don't know I just don't see it happening. It should happen, but I don't think it does. But it actually backtracks to my remarks about what I think is the necessity of political scientists to just simply be more aware of the debate. I think too often political scientists are glib. And in the sense that we will simply take a definition off the shelf oftentimes and run with it without necessarily looking at the history and the argumentation and the debate surrounding the concept. And I think that's potentially true in the case of religion. I'm with Tim and Monica in that I think it's, in some ways, I don't want to say it's fruitless to debate what are the boundaries of religion. I actually think it's a useful conversation to have. I don't think it's going to be, it's like most of our concepts, it will be contested forever. I do think that what is required is that as scholars, I would say, is that we have a responsibility to be clear about the way we're using our concepts and to be aware of the history of those concepts. And I think in the way that you, I think, have done in God's Century, which is they use a concept that people may not agree with, but it's clear that they've actually wrestled with the alternatives and come up with one that works for them. And as you might have guessed, in the kind of work that I've done, which I think many of the concepts that we use in political science are purpose-built, does it help us actually explore issues in the world that otherwise would be uncovered, is that different cultures have different understandings of these boundaries. And I just simply, as you might have guessed from my comments, follow Durkheim in the question of the relationship between the sacred and the profane, in part because, and I agree with Tim, it's messy when you get down to trying to create boundaries. But that's part of what I love about it, is that it takes things that we might otherwise dismiss as not religious, like the nation or human rights or humanity, and says, guess what? They're part of the sacred. They have the same kinds of effects. And I think that's what's interesting and important.
Simon, you're not, you really? Okay, you've given your time to somebody else, all right. Jane in the front here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jane Little. I host a religion program on the BBC Radio 4 in England, and I'm currently working as a generalist at the Washington Bureau, so trying to cover politics here. And before that, I was a religion correspondent in England. And I wanted to bring in the media because you're talking about what progress has been made in scholarship and with policy as well. But the media, it was interesting your conceptualization, Tim, of 3 stages, because I think that very much fits where we've been at as well. When I started the job at the end of the 90s as religion correspondent at the World Service, I was given 4 weeks to see if it was worth covering religion, and there was huge resistance in the newsroom, and I knew...
There had never been a religion correspondent before?
There'd never been one before at the World Service. Bear in mind our biggest audiences were in Africa and Asia, where I pointed out to one man religion kind of mattered. But no, there was a huge deal of resistance, and it had a lot more to do with who was editing a program that day as to whether I got a story on the air rather than how important the story was. I think that changed instantly. 9/11, I basically needed to clone myself. It was so busy, but it was hard religion. It was the theology of suicide bombing. I got absolutely sick of writing about that. And then it shifted again, and we are in this stage 3 where it's about nuance and complexity, but paradoxically, there are fewer resources to dedicate to it. There are fewer and fewer religion specialists out there. The World Service no longer has one, and isn't about to get one. So it's really important, I think, when you're talking interdisciplinary stuff and when you're talking about scholars engaging with policymakers, to engage the media, because I think there is a genuine interest and thirst to understand more about religion, whether it's religion in the box or out of the box, how to conceptualize it. There's a great deal of interest there. So that's just an observation, really. But I also had a specific question to Alfred, really, sort of linked to this, how to understand the role of Islam in the Arab Spring, and specifically on Egypt. I mean, an example of how complex the issue is the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood has adopted a candidate at second choice who's more of an Islamist than the Salafis have adopted. So it's really sort of how you kind of explain that and what's happening in Egypt, essentially. I know that's not a 2-minute answer, but I'm particularly interested in that.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Well, it's comparisons. I remember when I in June 2011, I talked to 2 or 3 of the key people from the Muslim Brotherhood, including the more progressive Muslim Brotherhood presidential candidate. But he was thrown out the week I was there. He was thrown out because his feeling was the existing platform of the Muslim Brotherhood, this is in June, sort of well after Mubarak's out, still said no woman or no Coptic could be president of Egypt. I showed that to Ghannouchi, and he said, well, hey, he says, democracy is simple. This Ghannouchi in Tunisia. Every citizen is equal. They're taking 60% of the people out. And this is the same, this is the opposition candidate who got thrown out, who may do reasonably well, but anyway, he was against this too. Second thing they had in was because the military, for their own reasons, changed the Constitution in 1982 to say that Sharia is, they changed it from a source of law to the source of law, the main source. Now, once that's in the Constitution, first of all, it's path dependent. It's terribly hard to change something like that because it's so easy to mobilize against it. So that very complex March 2011 vote, I was there at that time, and virtually any mosque I went by was saying it will be an attack on Article 2, vote for the military, because they understand we're not going to change Article 2, which is this one, okay? Then the Muslim Brotherhood said, well, given that it existed, then who can decide whether a law is really fully consistent with Sharia? So they also proposed, this is nothing like this remotely in Tunisia. They also had in their platform that imams should have an electoral system themselves where they elected members of the Constitutional Court to decide whether. So I asked Ghannouchi about that, and he said, look, he knew that here's one of the people I interviewed in 2001 on twin tolerations. He says, well, that's a clear violation of the twin tolerations, right? And okay, so there's a huge difference here. And,
Quite an unusual thing for Ghannouchi.
oh, he is, but he's got his, he's quite unusual. But that's an interesting, his travel in that area, and he's written maybe about 60 or 70 articles, so one can look at that travel because he signed them, and he comments on what he thought when he went to Iran. He went to Iran much more optimistic than he came back. He was in Algeria at the beginning of the war, and he was much more optimistic. But then, when later he said, whatever we do, we can't have Algeria, and this is crazy to have Iran. And so he arrived at this position, 15 years ago. Now, the saddest thing about the Egypt case is that the liberals, basically within 2 weeks of the transfer of power from the president, the liberals were campaigning, and I was with them in discussion groups. They were campaigning to make sure that somehow the military wrote the Constitution before the election for the Constituent Assembly. Because so I would call this in theoretical terms a Brumerian abdication of the citizens' responsibility. So liberals did everything they could to avoid transferring power, have an election transfer power. And they didn't campaign very well. So, and they didn't have one single discussion and signed document. My co-author for the last 40 years, Juan Lins, kept asking me, he says, Al, send me the documents from Egypt about how the secularists and the religious people are talking and agreeing. I said, they haven't had one meeting. So then later when I discovered that since 2003, there have been regular meetings. 5 of the 6 parties with the biggest representation in the Constituent Assembly been meeting, talking since 2003. There hasn't been one conversation like that. So that's part of the difference. Then when you throw out someone, they're still so hierarchical, they had to look, well, who can we substitute? And they went to, in their sense, he was a fairly senior person in the Muslim Brotherhood. Terrible candidate, terrible ideas, but they're, that's really unfortunate.
I've got a question in the middle.
Thank you. Gillian Lint, at one time at Columbia University. Just 2 points. I am
the religion department and the graduate school, right?
Well, my own background was joint history and sociology as a PhD. And halfway through my career, because I don't have those kinds of joint appointments, I was asked to join the religion department. And I remember when they asked me, I said, I think you have the wrong person. I don't do religion. And I, at that time, assumed that religion was theology. That's how little I knew. Anyway, it was fascinating. I ended up joining them. But what I'm struck by was that for the 25 years or so I was there, a lot of the students would come, and I represented sort of social science theory and methodology in that department. What was fascinating is I obviously got religious studies and comparative religion students. I got sociologists, I got anthropologists, I got, however, virtually no political scientists and a few economists. So that, I think, shows how deep that divide was. But secondly, with regard to the matter of the question of conceptualizations of religion, I would hope very much that whereas apparently there is not a separate essay in this book, that an interesting project here would be to read the book, read all the articles, and then reflect on what has this contributed to the reconceptualization of religion. Because so much of that, as several speakers have already mentioned, comes from people within religious studies, primarily philosophers or theologians, and I think having a perspective of what difference does it make when you're studying world affairs, and what are the key issues about religion, location and time, that are most important.
Thank you, Professor Lance. Sounds like something to ask the Luce Foundation for more money to do. I think it's an excellent suggestion in all seriousness. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do, given we've got 5 minutes or so, is to just take as many questions as possible and comments, and then we'll try to address them as we can. So yes, please, Professor.
Hello, Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Georgetown University Anthropology Department and Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. I have a question that has to do with proselytizing. Katherine brought it up. It is a key concern as far as people's perceptions of religion and blockages about issues of politics and development. So I hope that we can touch on that a little bit more in terms of why it's been a problem to get religion involved in some of these projects.
Thank you. And then, yes, sir.
I'm Amjad Chaudhry. I'm from Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and I think this book is very nice, and you have introduced very well. But this is like political or academic book. But if you ask a religious person, there's only one God, and that had created so many religions. And the religions are to take the person to the God, as close to the God as it can be possible. The thing is that just Jesus and many prophets, Muhammad, peace be upon all, they have predicted the coming of, second coming of Jesus. And that time had passed away. The God always sent the people in time, not after the time. So what I'm saying is, the thing, Ahmadiyya movement community had launched a big campaign about the unity of mankind in the religion and the peace and the justice. And I think that is working very well. And there's a www.mta.tv that you can also go there and you can see what is going on.
Yes. I've seen some of the posters on the Metro, right? You had a campaign in the Metro, yes. Yeah. Yes, Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Hyde. I'm with the Religion Consulting Group, and I'm interested in your teaching experience. You've tossed out one anecdote of how these ideas are going with either your undergraduate students or graduate students. Could you give us some more anecdotes about how the generation coming along is responding to the work you're doing?
Great question.
I'm Juliet Schmidt. I work with Search for Common Ground. We do conflict transformation work, and I work on a program that does Muslim Western understanding. I personally spend a lot of time in some of the countries that have been mentioned today doing training of either of media on how to report on conflict, which generally includes a component on religion, or on civil society and religious leaders and how to reach out to the media and have their voices heard in that aspect. We're also looking at doing a project here in the United States, funded by Henry Luce as well, and the project is about how do we talk about the intersection between policy, media, and religion in the United States as well. And I was wondering if the book touched on this at all as a component.
My name is Noble Samuel. I'm guest here from UK. I'm minister over there in London. I just want to appreciate that you took this initiative, and it's a wonderful. I just read the content of this book, and I love to buy that. And as my friend Alfred Stefan was talking about the democracy in the Muslim countries, I think in the presence of this tension throughout the world, when we are struggling for the equality and the religious harmony, this book will be very helpful in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, I just quickly want to address your question, and forgive me your name, Juliet. There are two chapters in the book about media and about the important role of media, the political impact, but also some discussion of how media treatment of religion has evolved. That's by Diane Winston. It's an excellent scholar of religion and the media at the University of Southern California. So that's an easy question to answer. None of the other questions are easy to answer, even if we had another hour. But if anyone wants to take a shot at the quick questions we had, Al.
I'll just respond a bit to the question of proselytizing, especially because you're an East European specialist. Probably the greatest moment of the desire for religious autonomy in the Orthodox Church of Russia was in the first 2 or 3 years after the fall of communism. And then really, and if one was looking for self-criticism, probably the fact that they had been so penetrated by the Communist Party and they didn't have autonomy over their appointments or their funding. So there probably should have been a search for greater autonomy over funding, search for greater autonomy over appointments. But what happened was the Orthodox Church, and they're called the Bulgarian Orthodox Church and the Romanian Orthodox, so they have a relationship to the state that's different in the sense of Catholicism, which had it at one time, but at least it has more capacity to be different financially or an appointment of bishops. What happened in Russia, as I understand it, I have 2 Russians in my seminar that I'm teaching, both of them writing on the subject. We could all be wrong. But a big thing they said was the huge entry of mainly American, but proselytizers. And this panicked the church that hadn't really reorganized itself. And in some places, like valleys in Bulgaria, there were more Americans than there were people from Bulgarian Orthodox Church. And the easiest thing to do was to revert back to type, which is embrace the state and ask the state to protect you against competition. And that's what happened. And then, so just a month ago, in the election, the primate Trill said that Putin was a gift from God and a miracle. And now, this is in a highly, and of course, as you've seen, when you go to Russia, you see an amazing amount, it wasn't only Putin, but of gold plate on the churches now. I mean, there's been a real rapprochement, whereas, in fact, in Greece, they began some self-criticism. The Greek military coup, as soon as they came in, they threw out the primate. Then there was a coup within a coup, and you had a different primate within 3 weeks. And then when the civilians came back, they had a different primate. And all of a sudden, people say, well, wait a minute, we got to start thinking about how do we create autonomy? How do we create our own funding? They still haven't done it, but they've thought about it.
Yeah, thank you, Al. Michael, you wanted to speak to the question
Just
about teaching?
On the teaching, yeah. One of my one of the consequences of my engagement with this work is that I now actually teach a course. I taught my first course on religion and world affairs, and at the undergraduate level at GW. And I have to say, one of the interesting aspects was trying to at first convince students that religion was not simply out there, because there is, I think, a tendency among many students to presume that religion is irrational, religion is traditional, religion is all these things, and it's not us. So in many ways, like the way that I think anthropologists might, more in the way that people talk about culture, culture's out there, it's not here. One of the aspects, at least in terms of my teaching, was to try to get students first to rethink in complex ways this notion of religion. But then I spent a lot of time talking about religion and American foreign policy and the extent to which all of a sudden the students are going, my God, we're a religious country. And what does that mean? And it's not just simply other countries are religious, but it's that our country might be religious as well. And it, that was a debating point, and it was actually a fascinating set of conversations with the students. And so for me, part of the mission, and when I teach this kind of course, is actually to get students to reflect more critically about that the out there is actually in here. And that actually is for me, part of the joys of teaching.
So, I started my talk with an anecdote, but that was years ago. It still may happen again in the classroom, but I suspect not as much. And I think actually the level of sophistication among the students is improved because it's so much more of part of our discourse. And then also, Michael was saying that he doesn't have as many interdisciplinary students. I actually do. I have students who are now crossing disciplines, religious studies and political science, and I have 2 students who are doing incredible work now, trying to really understand fundamentally sort of the theological basis of the political actors, religious actors that they're looking at, and then going into the more international relations theorizing. So I think there is some progress made. My big question is will I be able to get these students jobs? So when they go on the market, will we be able to place them into the universities? It's all well and good for them to study Catholicism and the role of John Paul II in democratization in the 80s and 90s, but can I then, is that a valid enough, valued enough topic of study that people trust that they'll be able to teach more mainstream undergraduates, masters, and PhD students on their own? And we're not there yet. We don't know.
Well, on that encouraging note, Monica, thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking the panel: Katherine Marshall, Michael Barnett, Monica Toft, Alfred Stepan, Tom Farr. And let me just thank a few people here at the Berkley Center: Julie Espinoza on camera over there, and Kyle Vandermeulen, and others in the Berkley Center staff who made this event possible. Tom Banshoff, our director, of course. And again, thanks to the Luce Foundation and the Social Science Research Council, without whom we would not be here. We would not have the book. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you.